pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of an absolutely incredible work of modern Korean fiction, Trees on a Slope by Hwang Sun-won, translated from the Korean by Bruce and Ju-chan Fulton. The original Korean novel was published in 1960, and this English translation was published in 2005. The first thing to say before I forget is, this is a gorgeous softcover edition from the University of Hawaii Press, and they screwed up. So there are 2 pages missing, not only from my copy, but every copy. And those are pages 37 and 38. When I got to that very important part of the story and noticed the pages were missing, although I think maybe it was my buddy reader, Roz of Scallydandling about the books, that got there first, I freaked out, sent a panicked email to the University of Hawaii Press and to the translator, and I'm glad that I CC'd the translator. It's not his fault, but he's the one who replied. I never did hear back from the publisher, but Bruce Fulton emailed me the missing pages, so he was well aware of this erratum in the book and has sent it on to me. I'm going to upload those 2 missing pages onto my Google Drive and put a link in the show notes, because you need it, and then you know where to get it. It's in the show notes in my review. Okay, that out of the way, let me tell you about this wrenching novel. This is a novel about the Korean War, and it's one of the few, at least of its era, that was ever written, published in 1960, about the Korean War and the effect the Korean War had on Korean society from the perspective of South Korea's preeminent novelist. Hwang Sun-won died in the year 2000, aged 85. I discovered his work because I picked up a copy of an obscure little collection of his short stories, published in English in Korea, A Man, translated by the same Fulton translators. And this was part of a portable library of Korean literature, which is out of print. You can't get it even used. I was so lucky to find this at a used bookstore in Tokyo, where I live. Didn't know anything about the author. I just bought it. It was like $2 or something. And finally, many years later, read it and fell in love with the man's writing. So I have a separate review of this. I'll put a link in the show notes, but this is impossible to find. There are other editions of Hwang Sun-won's short fiction that are more readily available, and I'm looking forward to getting those. Almost all of them, or perhaps all of them, have been translated by the Fultons. The story centers on 3 soldiers in the dying days of before the armistice. It's like I think a week, 2 weeks before the armistice that the story opens. And the 3 men are Shawn Tae, who is charismatic, a badass, and has definitely a darker, villainous side. Tong Ho, who is sensitive, poetic, ruminative, and romantic. And Young-gu, who is kind of in, maybe I would say, in between those 2 polar opposite personalities. Hwang Sun-won doesn't dwell on the battle scenes or the grotesque and violent aspects of war making, but he also doesn't shy away from it. Like me, you might ask yourself, do I really need to read another war novel? And in this case, but to the degree that it is a war story, yes, you do. Yes, you do. It's just written with such a light touch, staring the violence and the horror and the fury and the love and the lust that propels these men in the face unflinchingly, and shows more facets than I was ready to encounter. So I'm going to go right to a longer excerpt that I want to read you. I'm going to read you most of chapter 4. I'm going to cut out only a page, so I'm going to read a couple pages to you. So sit back, get a cup of coffee or a glass of soju, the Korean national liquor. We have it in Japan. It's one of my main drinks, and it's got an extra sound in it. It's shoju. In Korea, it's soju, but it's basically the same drink. There's also in this excerpt, reference to another Korean drink, makgeolli or makgeolli, which is a milky kind of type of, like a sake, kind of. This is just after the armistice, and so most of the action, most of this story happens immediately after the armistice, when they're still in the location where they'd just recently been fighting, where they stay for several weeks. And so this chapter all happens post-armistice, and they're still encamped. So again, Hyuntae is the badass with the dark side. Tong-ho is the sweet, sensitive guy, and these are very insufficient descriptors, as you will find out when you read the novel. Young-gu is the other guy, who I'm not going to try to describe. Tong-ho left a girlfriend back home, Sugi, and this goes into quite a bit of detail about his memories of her and his pining for her. War survivors may suppress their joy behind a gloomy facade out of compassion and respect for their departed comrades. But those who contrive this gesture of respect may also disregard it, and among men it is often alcohol that induces the disregard. With the Satogomi base less than 10 miles from the front, the men had to be in a state of constant readiness. This meant training and drills in the morning, and camp cleanup and maintenance in the afternoon. Sunday was no exception. But in mid-September, on the conclusion of the prisoner exchange that was part of the armistice agreement, Sunday leave became available. The destination of a group obtaining a Sunday pass depended on the depth of their pockets. Normally it was a drinking place or a comfort station. Following hard on the heels of the armistice, clutches of opportunists had flocked to the bases to do business with the soldiers. Drinking places with hostesses began to increase. Licensed comfort stations came into being, and pimps arrived, each with a stable of streetwalkers. The usual pattern for an outing was soju or makgeolli without the customary snacks, followed by a drunken brawl which could break out at the slightest pretext, or a visit to a comfort station or brothel. The alcohol-induced stimulation and the odor of a woman enhanced the men's joy at being alive. Hyuntae developed a knack for gaining Sunday leave for himself, Tong-ho, and Young-gu. "Well, what are we waiting for?" said Hyuntae. "We've got more of the governor's money to blow." During his stay at the field hospital, Hyuntae had received spending money from his father. The governor had been quite successful importing beef tallow for soap making, but the war ruined this business. He had then managed to re-establish himself while a refugee in Busan, this time in the sugar business. They went to a drinking shack, and when Hyuntae was suitably drunk, he produced some banknotes from his pocket and pretended to sniff them. "What a sweet smell! Never fails! Doesn't seem right to spend it on something that tastes so sour." He turned to Young-gu. "Time for you-know-what! Got to stand up and be counted." And then he eyed Tong-ho. "Why don't you take this? Buy yourself some caramels and write a sweet little ditty while you're chewing." He dropped a few 100-won notes in front of Tong-ho, then left with Young-gu. Young-gu readily followed Hyuntae at such times, his pleasure undiminished by the knowledge that it was made possible by someone else's money. Tong-ho, for his part, was thankful that Hyuntae, though he teased him about his fussiness toward women, didn't insist on including him in his outings with Young-gu. Tong-ho bought a pack of cigarettes and had a smoke. Then he climbed the hill behind the base to where some pines had been felled to provide timber for camp repairs and fuel for the oncoming winter. He found a stump and perched himself there after covering the surface with undergrowth to keep the pitch from getting on his pants. Now he could retreat yet again into a world of his own, a world in which he entertained thoughts of Sugi. The land behind the base had gone to waste, the elevated paths barely visible, the only evidence that it had once been cultivated. Untouched for 3 years by plowshare or hoe, the earth was broken in places to reveal the ochre soil. Weeds flourished. They had more of a yellow tinge than when Tong-ho had last been here. The early October sun beat down relentlessly, toughening the berry seeds that lay in the dirt and increasing their chances of surviving the winter. He had consumed less than half of what Hyuntae and Young-gu had drunk, but felt the alcohol warming his ears, as well as the pleasant sensation of the breeze from the ridge cooling them. Perhaps it was the imminent arrival of harvest season that brought to mind the image of a peach as he thought of Sugi. But what kind of peach? It wasn't a nectarine with its bare skin, or a sumo peach with its fuzz and soft flesh. Tong-ho didn't know the name of the variety, could only sketch its appearance in his mind. White skin, short fuzz, middling firm flesh. There was something unusual about Sugi's profile, and one day Tong-ho had sat in different places to observe it, an experiment of sorts. It didn't catch your eye if you looked at her straight on, but it came into view if the angle and lighting were right. If the light source was diagonally to the rear, or to the side and above, her face was shaded except for the straight sure bridge of her nose. And as you sighted toward the perfectly rising tip, you could make out a faint halo about the tip and nostrils, a lighting effect you wouldn't ordinarily notice. This halo was very much like peach fuzz, or the bloom on grapes and persimmons, only softer and finer, making you want not so much to feel it as to melt it with your breath. Tong-ho had discovered it that night, 2 years previous, in the Hyundai Beach Hotel room, where they had stayed at Sugi's suggestion, and for which they had emptied their pockets. The memorable send-off that Sugi had planned for so long. In that secluded room, with thick snowflakes falling outside, they had spent practically the whole night awake, and the following morning, after a long kiss, he had caressed the tip of her nose and her nostrils with his lips. It was that morning, clear and bright, when they were laughing in childlike delight at the discovery of the third fold in her eyelid and the contrast it made with her other eye, that Tong-ho had chanced to notice, in the sunlight streaming through the window, that faint halo. "That's the most delicate peach fuzz I'll ever see," he had mumbled to himself, "and it'll never come off." So I'm going to skip ahead. I'm not going to read you the part that comes next, where Tong-ho visits a grocery store and asks the old man to identify the name of the peach by his description of this peach, and go directly to the conclusion of this chapter. Tong-ho returned to the base to find Hyuntae and Young-gu already back. Young-gu left without a word to wash his underwear and socks at the well. Hyuntae was stretched out in bed. "Hey, poet," he said. "Been off by your lonesome all this time? Something on your mind? Well, bear up. Won't be too long before we're discharged, and then you can be with your sweetheart." He displayed his arms. "Want to hear a story? Damn, you should have seen the fuss my girl made over these scars. Just look at that new skin, how red it is, and smoother than the other. It's so pretty I could die. She went crazy, licking and sucking on it. So I told her, if you really think it's so swell, why don't I make you a scar of your own? Know what she said? I already have them, more than I can count. Good God. And they'll never heal, long as I live. Now, get this. If 2 of us with scars could have a nice life together, I'd never ask for anything more. Give me a break. Who'd want to live with a wretched woman who doesn't know when to shut up? I wasn't in too good a mood after that, and I won't be in any hurry to see her again." Tong-ho waited until Hyuntae fell asleep, then wrote Sugi a letter. In the letter, he wrote about peaches, and added that he hoped he'd be able to see Sugi peach before the white peaches came into season the following year. Okay, well, that long excerpt, most of Chapter 4, gives you a taste of Hwang Sun-won's writing, gives you a sense of the characters, especially of Tong-ho and Hyuntae, and also of Tong-ho's solitude and his very romantic yearnings for his girlfriend Sugi. Also, it took me a long time to realize this and to think back to this passage and reread it. It unlocks the title, Trees on a Slope. So that's how I'd like to finish up this review, is by talking about what that solitary subjective space that Tong-ho reserves for himself, that he seeks out, that he creates on the hill behind the camp with the trees and sitting in nature while his 2 buddies are off drinking and whoring around. Thinking back on his one true love, yearning and being poetic and romantic and gentle, that very vulnerable physical, mental, emotional spiritual space that Tong Ho manages to eke out in this very violent, macho life of a soldier sets him apart. He sets himself apart, and he keeps his beautiful personality intact right through to the end of the war, into the early days of the armistice. And tragedy occurs. And I'm not going to say any more about it, but I just want to say that as much as this is a story of war and what war does to men, I think that this novel, Trees on a Slope, is actually about women and about misogyny. I mean, first of all, trigger warning for sexual violence, murder, war crimes perpetrated against women. I mean, it just runs the gamut. Juxtaposed against this very soft, gentle man, Tong Ho, and his pining for his peach-nosed love, and the fact that he cannot keep himself out of that maelstrom of misogyny, it just ripped my heart out. So this novel, as much as it gave me a new understanding through a profoundly literary novel about war, about male friendship in South Korea in this era, at its most elemental, this novel took me into the dark heart of the hatred of femininity, the incredibly violent misogyny that prevents men from being tender themselves and causes them to go literally berserk in the most murderous ways possible when women become vulnerable with them. It's still fucking me up, and I am not complaining. Reading this was a shattering experience that I think that you need to have. Oof. Thanks for watching.